The storm had passed hours ago, leaving the valley washed in a hard, blue silence. In the first cabin off the road, a kerosene lamp still burned with a thin, steady flame, its glass chimney filmed with soot. On the table, 2 tin plates waited beneath a slow ribbon of steam rising from a pot of caribou stew. A spoon lay where a hand had set it down mid-meal. Beside it, a wool cap was folded with the careful square of a habit never meant to be broken. The front door stood just open enough for the wind to worry the latch, but the snowdrift against the threshold was pristine, uncut by boot or paw. Across the single room, a wall clock had stopped at 3:17. Every clock in town, they would later notice, had stopped at the same minute. Outside, the dog lines hung slack and silent. The radio set on the shelf gave a faint breath of static when its dial was touched, as if something were still listening. At the edge of the lamp's light, a child's red mitten waited on the floor, palm up, like a small question that no one answered. Nothing was overturned. Nothing was broken. It looked less like a place abandoned and more like a scene paused, life interrupted between one heartbeat and the next. Standing in that doorway, with stew cooling and snow whispering at the sill, the only honest question was the one no one wanted to say out loud: what happened here, at 3:17? As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before it vanished, Whitaker's Hollow was the kind of place most maps forgot to name. A handful of wooden cabins tucked between 2 ridges, a single dirt road winding toward the frozen river, and a radio tower that blinked faintly through the snow like a heartbeat. In 1959, fewer than 50 people lived there, trappers, miners, and families who'd chosen solitude over the noise of Anchorage. Their days followed the slow rhythm of survival, mending nets, chopping wood, tuning in to weather reports that always began the same way: cold front moving south. There was a store that sold canned peaches and shotgun shells, a schoolhouse with 12 desks and a coal stove that smoked on windy days. Every evening, the same orange glow spilled from cabin windows as people gathered for supper, the wind pushing against their walls like a polite reminder of where they lived. The town's only connection to the outside world was the shortwave radio in the sheriff's cabin. When storms hit, it was their lifeline, a way to ask for medicine, to report a lost hunter, or sometimes just to hear another human voice. But Whitaker's Hollow wasn't supposed to be isolated forever. That year, the government announced a small survey project. Engineers were mapping underground radar cables for the Cold War defense network stretching through Alaska. The team was due to arrive in late November, just before the snow sealed the roads for good. Until then, life carried on as usual: children sledding behind the store, men setting traps in the woods, dogs barking at the sound of the wind. No one in Whitaker's Hollow knew it yet, but those would be the last normal days the town would ever have. On November 17, 1959, a cold front moved in from the Bering Sea earlier than anyone expected. Snow fell for 3 days straight, burying the narrow road that connected Whitaker's Hollow to the nearest outpost 70 miles away. No one thought much of it. Winter had come early before. But that week, something in the air felt heavier, like the valley itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, the first sign appeared. The town's shortwave radio, the only link to the outside world, began to hum, then flatten into static. The sheriff, who kept the radio in his cabin, tried to retune the signal. The frequency meter flickered once, then dropped to 0. He tapped the dial, listening to the hollow sound of nothing. By morning, the silence had spread. The dogs outside no longer barked. The birds were gone. Even the sound of wind seemed to fade beneath the snow. One of the miners, John Heller, wrote a note in his weather log: "The air feels wrong. Everything is too still." At 3:05 a.m., Anchorage lost contact with the station. The last transmission was a faint male voice repeating coordinates, then cutting off mid-sentence. When the state patrol tried to reach them by relay, every attempt returned the same pattern: a burst of static, followed by the sharp click of a line going dead. By dawn, the storm had stopped, but the valley remained wrapped in absolute silence. When rescue teams finally reached the outer ridge 2 days later, they found tire tracks leading into the town, none coming out. Inside the sheriff's cabin, the radio was still warm to the touch. The coffee pot was half full, and on the wall above the desk, the clock had frozen at exactly 3:17 a.m. No one would ever hear a sound from Whitaker's Hollow again. When the rescue team reached Whitaker's Hollow 2 days later, the sky was a washed-out gray, and the snow had turned the valley into a pale desert. They came on snowmobiles, 5 men from Anchorage and 2 local trappers who knew the terrain. From a distance, the town looked intact: Smoke still hung in the air like breath that had frozen mid-exhale. At first, they thought they were too late. Then they realized there was no one to be late for. Every door stood slightly open, as if someone had just stepped out. Inside, everything remained in place, dishes on tables, beds still warm beneath the blankets, a kettle on a stove whistling faintly until it ran dry. The air smelled of kerosene and something sweet, like frozen fruit left to rot. They found the first strange sign in the sheriff's cabin. The radio was still powered, its tubes glowing a dull orange, but there was no sound. A single note lay on the desk, there outside the snow line. No one knew what it meant. Near the note was a mug of coffee, half empty, its surface sealed with a thin sheet of ice. As they moved from house to house, a pattern emerged. In every building, the clocks had stopped, not all at the same moment, but within seconds of each other. 3:16, 3:17, 3:18, it was as if time itself had faltered, stuttering to a halt across the valley. Outside, one of the men called out. His voice was swallowed instantly, not by echo, but by silence, a silence so dense it felt physical. He pointed to the tree line beyond the last cabin, a smooth stretch of snow, untouched except for a single trail of footprints leading toward the forest. The prints went on for 30 yards, then simply ended, as though the person had been lifted away. The team followed them until their compasses began to spin. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in under a minute. One of the trappers swore he could hear something moving under the ice, not water, but a slow dragging, like cloth across glass. By sundown, the men decided to leave. They marked the area, took photographs, and sealed the cabins until investigators could arrive. On the way back, one of them turned on his handheld radio out of habit. The static came alive, and underneath it, faintly, a voice whispered the same coordinates that had been sent from the town 2 nights earlier. The recording would later be replayed dozens of times. Every expert said the same thing, there were 7 men in the rescue team. The voice on that tape makes 8. In the weeks that followed, Whitaker's Hollow became a headline that no one could explain and everyone wanted to forget. The rescue team's report was brief, too brief. It mentioned missing persons, cause undetermined, and advised further investigation once conditions improve. But the snow never melted that year. By the time spring came, the valley was buried under 15 feet of ice. The state police sent a second unit in May 1960, once the thaw began. They found the cabins partially collapsed under the weight of snow. Every photograph taken during that expedition showed a strange distortion, pale lines across the film, as if the light itself had been bent. Technicians blamed exposure errors, but none of the other cameras that day were affected. The official line settled on hypothermic confusion, a documented state where victims of extreme cold wander from shelter, disoriented, removing their clothing as their bodies shut down. It was a tidy explanation, the kind that fit in a report. Yet it didn't explain the footprints that ended mid-stride, or why 23 residents vanished while the dogs and supplies remained. It didn't explain the radio still humming when the first patrol arrived. And it didn't explain the voice. That voice. The recording from the rescue team was examined by both the FBI and the Air Force, each claiming jurisdiction under national security. Acoustic specialists said the signal's frequency matched none of the known military bands at the time. The voice was faint, distorted, and repeated only one line, "They're outside the snow line." When slowed down, a second tone appeared beneath it, a low resonance, almost mechanical, like a distant engine or breath. Local Inupiat elders were consulted. They spoke of Kalapalik, a creature said to live beneath the ice, drawing those who stray too far from their fires. "It sings with the wind," they said. "It calls your name in the voice of someone you trust." For a while, the press loved that version, the monster under the ice. But by autumn, the headlines stopped. Military trucks were seen near the area, and the road leading to the valley was closed due to instability. Officially, the site became part of a Cold War communication testing zone. Unofficially, no one ever went back. And yet, on cold nights, shortwave operators across Alaska still report hearing that same frequency, an open channel carrying only static, punctuated by a faint, rhythmic pulse. Always at 3:17 a.m. By the winter of 1961, Whitaker's Hollow had disappeared from every official record. Maps were redrawn, archives updated, and the valley renamed simply as Sector 42N. The government cited unstable terrain and risk of avalanche, sealing off the area to the public. The few reporters who tried to visit were stopped at military checkpoints and told the same thing, "There's nothing there." But not everyone forgot. The families of the missing sent letters for years, pleas for updates, for explanations, for bodies to bury. Most went unanswered. The few replies they received were curt and identical, no further information available. Decades passed. Snow reclaimed the valley. The old access road vanished beneath drifts taller than the telegraph poles. Pilots flying over the region began reporting strange magnetic interference. Their compasses would spin erratically whenever they crossed the coordinates once known as Whitaker's Hollow. Satellite imagery showed only an unbroken sheet of white, no structures, no shadows, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. In 1983, a geophysical survey crew drilling for oil north of the old site recorded a burst of electromagnetic noise that lasted exactly 41 seconds. The pattern matched the 1959 radio transmission, right down to the final pulse. When the data was sent for analysis, it was flagged and classified before the report was released. Today, no one can legally enter the valley. The official explanation remains permafrost instability. Yet every few years, hikers in the surrounding ranges claim to hear a hum under the snow, steady, rhythmic, mechanical. Some even say they picked up a signal on shortwave radios late at night, faint and distant, whispering coordinates in a voice almost, but not quite, human. If Whitaker's Hollow ever existed, time has erased it. But somewhere beneath that endless white, the clocks may still be frozen at 3:17 a.m., waiting for someone to start them again. There's a point where mystery stops being a story and becomes a wound, not something to solve, but something you live with. Whitaker's Hollow is that kind of wound. A quiet scar in the map that reminds us how fragile our version of reality really is. Every attempt to explain what happened there, science, folklore, conspiracy, shares the same flaw: it assumes the world makes sense. That events must have reasons, that people vanish because something did it to them. But maybe the truth is colder. Maybe things simply stop, and the universe doesn't notice. Time did not move forward in Whitaker's Hollow. It folded in on itself, like a breath caught halfway. Somewhere, inside that fold, are 23 people still sitting at their tables, still listening for a signal that never returns. Their clocks forever frozen at 3:17, not dead, not alive, just paused. The state calls it a closed case. The valley has no name now, and on the maps, there's only white. But every story leaves an echo. And if you stand in the right place, on a still enough night, you might hear it too, a faint hum beneath the wind, pulsing in threes, waiting for someone to listen. Because what disappeared in that valley wasn't just a town. It was the certainty that the world keeps turning even when no one's left to see it.